Great. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the final session for today called Indigenous Geographies. My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the librarian here, and I'm excited to invite Maggie Blackhawk, who is a relatively new arrival in the city of Philadelphia, but has been a great addition to the intellectual community here in Philadelphia. Professor Blackhawk teaches at the law school at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a specialist in constitutional law, federal Indian law, and legislation. Her projects recently have examined the ways American democracy can and should empower minorities, especially outside of traditional rights and court-based frameworks. She has published numerous articles in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Journal, and the Cambridge University Press, and a whole range of other places. And her empirical projects have been supported by the American Political Science Association, which I also think is based in Philadelphia, perhaps, maybe not, and the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics, among many others. So welcome, Professor Blackhawk, and thank you.
So thank you so much to the APS, and especially to Patrick Spiro and to Adriana Link for their wonderful organization of this conference. It's always tough to be the panel in between you and happy hour, but we will do our best to entertain you as if you were at happy hour already. We can't promise that much, but we will try. And so our panelists today will focus their papers, as you've heard, on Indigenous geographies. And our speakers are just incredibly talented and incredibly talented specialists in this area. So let me walk through each of their bios, and then they will present their papers. Then I'll come up and give a few comments before opening it up for questions. Jeff Washburn is a doctoral candidate in the Arch Dalrymple III Department of History at the University of Mississippi. Is it an endowed department? Oh, how fun. His dissertation, Labor in the Field is Much Changed, the Chickasaws and the Civilization Plan 1790 to 1837, traces how the Chickasaws, through unified leadership and the geopolitical location of their country in the interior South, reinterpreted and manipulated the first federal Indian policy, known as a civilization plan, to one that fit within their own cultural lexicon and accelerated ongoing economic change in Chickasaw country. Washburn's recent article manuscript, Directing Their Own Change, Chickasaw Economic Transformation and the Civilization Plan, 1750s to 1830s, has been accepted by Native South and is slated for publication in 2020, so look out for that. He's presented his work at the American Society for Ethnohistory, the Southern Historical Association, and the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic annual conferences, and his work has been supported by the American Philosophical Society's, thank you, Phillips Fund. Austin Stewart is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Lehigh University, not yet endowed, but still waiting, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He currently resides in Bethlehem and is working towards completing his dissertation, which is tentatively titled Boundaries and Power, Western Cherokees, Territoriality, and the Politics of Land and Migration in the Trans-Mississippian West, 1763 to 1840. The project analyzes a substantial evolution of complex claims to land in the late 18th and early 19th century Trans-Mississippian West through the eyes of Cherokee migrants or Western Cherokees. Julie L. Reed is an associate professor of history at Penn State University and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Julie is currently working on her second book, tentatively titled, The Means of Education Shall Forever Be Encouraged in This Nation, A Cherokee and American Educational History. Her first book, Serving the Nation, Cherokee Sovereignty and Social Welfare, 1800 to 1907, examined the move from kinship-based systems of care at the turn of the century to the development of national social service programs and institutions, including pensions, a prison, a mental health facility, and an orphanage, established in the aftermath of the Civil War. So, thank you. Jeff, would you like to start?
All right, first off, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And also, I just wanted to mention it was this morning when we were told that there's a few of us who are Phillips Funds or other ways supported by the American Philosophical Society, that this is our first time here at the APS, and I'm definitely one of them, and I am thrilled and thankful both for the opportunities that the Society has provided me previously and the opportunity to talk today. So, my talk focuses on mostly about the concept of the interior South. This is something that is starting to shape a large portion of my dissertation and will be a focus and topic as this kind of transforms into a book project as well. The era of the early republic witnessed dramatic economic change and increased settler encroachment by Americans in the native South. The Chickasaws provide an example of Southern Indian engagement with the politics of borders in this era of change and uncertainty. Chickasaw country, encompassing present-day northern Mississippi, southwestern Tennessee, western Alabama, and parts of Kentucky, affected how they interacted with Americans in the first decades of the United States. I propose using the geographic framework of the interior South to emphasize how Chickasaw distance from the United States population centers shape their responses to economic change in American settlements. This paper highlights the relationships the Chickasaws cultivated with the Americans in the East and the Quapaw in the West, and their interpretation of their geopolitical position in the native South, challenging preconceived notions of the long removal period and economic change in the American South. Chickasaw peace with the Quapaw was possibly just as important as Chickasaw friendship with the United States for their gradual adoption of new economic policies. Quapaw towns were located in the confluence of the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers, as you can kind of see in the map to my right, your left, where you can see those shaded portions both of Chickasaw country and Quapaw country. So Quapaw towns were located in the confluence of the Mississippi and Arkansas rivers, so their territory bordered the western boundaries of Chickasaw claims. For the Chickasaws, the Arkansas River Valley and its native ground, dominated by the Quapaw and Osage, factored into their relations with the United States and their adoption of new economic activities in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Through their alliances with the Quapaw, Chickasaws created an avenue for themselves to peacefully hunt in territory far away from American settlements, but still in proximity to Chickasaw country. So this is farther away from settler encroachment, less of a chance for them to interact violently with Americans. In 1804, federal agents noted that the, quote, Chickasaws are in the habit of making hunts west of the Mississippi, and proposed the idea of creating a trade factory across the river for convenience of Chickasaw hunters who hunted in the Arkansas River Valley well into the 1820s. Chickasaw young men secured access to hunting grounds hundreds of miles from American farmers, providing them with an avenue to still succeed in their old economy, reducing the need for them to engage in other activities like horse stealing, which could lead to confrontations with Americans. Looking back to the East, the Chickasaws used a pragmatic peace with the United States to their advantage in treaty negotiations and land cessions. Living in present-day northern Mississippi, the Chickasaws had nearly 300 miles and the entirety of Creek country between them and most of the American population. To the south, it was nearly another 300 miles travel from Chickasaw townships to the American settlements near Natchez, Mississippi. So I brought in a heat map that you can see on my right, your left. The other way around, there we go. What you can see with this is population centers and basically Americans advancing. And that green part that's in between Mississippi and Alabama, that really doesn't develop until after the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814. So what you see is basically the fact that the Chickasaws are not really surrounded with encroaching Americans. They're not dealing with large population centers at this time. So in the first decades of the United States, they didn't really suffer from an invasion of squatters and land speculators eyeing their lands, or from U.S. insistence on land cessions during treaty negotiations. For the Creeks and Cherokees, whose homelands abutted the American western border, constant American encroachment on their lands was an issue for the entirety of the early national period, and both signed more treaties ceding lands to the United States before 1805 than the Chickasaws did before removal. For the Creeks and Cherokees, tension, violence, and territorial changes along the frontier went hand in hand with federal negotiations and economic change. For Chickasaws in the interior South, economic change was not synonymously linked with land cessions. Early and often in treaty negotiations with the United States, Chickasaws stated that their distance made them good friends with the Americans. During the Treaty of Hopewell in 1786, Secretary of War Henry Knox noted that the, quote, distance of this nation from frontier settlements being so great is the principal reason that no complaints have been made of the encroachment of the whites. Chickasaw headmen agreed with this argument, noting as late as 1809 that, quote, friends and brothers, when too near to each other, their friendship is not so apt to continue. But when at a distance, friendship always remains firm and secure, and thus defined the peace as intrinsically connected to geopolitical space and territorial autonomy granted to them by the interior South. Chickasaw headmen demanded that American officials continue to signify and approve their territorial autonomy by notarizing maps in previous negotiations, or they simply threatened to walk out. After the 1792 treaty negotiations in Nashville, for example, Piomengo received notification from the United States confirming Chickasaw territory via a certificate signed by President George Washington, quote, respecting the bonds of the Chickasaw land. In 1801, Chickasaw headmen signed the Chickasaw Bluffs Treaty, permitting a federal path between the Cumberland settlements in Tennessee to new cotton plantations surrounding the growing Mississippi settlements near Natchez. Federal negotiators were quite surprised at the ease with which this was accomplished, noting that once Chickasaw headmen were assured that no land cessions would take place, they, quote, yielded with alacrity the road through their country. Chickasaw elites viewed the interior South as an opportunity to control the avenues that Americans traveled through their country and the economic opportunities provided through them. During negotiations, Chickasaw headman George Colbert and Chenubby demanded that all stands, taverns, or other platforms to profit from their road were to be owned and operated by Chickasaw families, demands that federal officials grudgingly accepted. Now, this does not mean that they didn't try to steal these economic opportunities later. In fact, most of the time, Mississippi territorial governors were not thrilled with this, and they did try and fight back, but in the end, Chickasaw headmen were able to exert their influence and keep Mississippi involvement inside of their economic activities on the Natchez Trace at bay. Treaty negotiations that led to the Trace once again centered on American acknowledgement of Chickasaw sovereignty, preserving political and territorial integrity of the interior South. American negotiators remarked that Chickasaw headmen, quote, expressed a strong desire that we should acknowledge their previously ratified map and documentation of territorial sovereignty. For the United States, it made practical sense to confirm Chickasaw territorial boundaries. American officials found it pragmatic to appease a southern Indian community that were friendly towards the United States until the time came when they were in the way of territorial advancement. Simply put, Chickasaw country was not directly in the path of Western frontier expansion until after the Red Stick War of 1813 and 1814. The interior South was a means to passively and peacefully resist encroaching frontiersmen on their territory. Through their manipulation of the interior South, Chickasaws retained significant influence in creating and crafting economic and political change in their country for the first 3 decades of their relationships with the United States. In 1814, however, Creek headmen were forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, ceding 23 million acres to the United States. The loss of land by the Creeks eroded the buffer between Chickasaws and American settlers, and soon after, thousands more settlers advanced near Chickasaw lands. Essentially, the Treaty of Fort Jackson marks the beginning of the end of the interior South, as the influx of settlers and increasing pressure for land cessions from both federal and state governments soon found its way to Chickasaw country. The concept of the interior South complicates the previous historiography of the early 19th century Native South, which was largely focused on the experiences of the Creeks and the Cherokees to the neglect of other southern Indian communities. As my dissertation further illustrates, outside of this paper, the interior South affected border violence, theft, settler encroachment. It was vital for the political stability of Chickasaw headmen. It affected the speed of economic change, and even played a role in the remarkable turnover of federal agents in Chickasaw country. Rather than a constant battle for the political and territorial autonomy, The interior South gave Chickasaws time to gradually incorporate new avenues of economic success during the first 3 decades of the United States. A dual policy of neutrality with the United States while cementing alliances in the West defined how they approached federal programs, negotiations, and the new Southern economy, and it was only possible due to their position within an interior South. Navigating a unique indigenous space between the Arkansas River Valley and the native South, Chickasaws benefited from both.
All right. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this panel and thank the APS for the opportunity to present my research. This will possibly piggyback right off of what Jeff just said. Okay, so this presentation will focus on further contextualizing what I argued in the paper, which was that surveying served as an important colonizing tool for early 19th century Cherokee immigrants or Western Cherokees. In my larger dissertation project, I seek to argue that Western Cherokees viewed mapping, or even the absence of mapping, as a means to legitimize their efforts to establish an Anglo-style settler state located within an expanding American empire. Western Cherokee selectively used Euro-American border-making practices to advance a broader colonizing agenda, which included the replacement of indigenous populations in the Arkansas River Valley and keeping Anglo-Americans outside the edges of their territory or contested territory. Following the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson, President Thomas Jefferson, U.S. Indian agents, and Henry Dearborn, who was the Secretary of State at the time, viewed Arkansas as the ideal place for Eastern tribes to exchange their lands and relocate their peoples because it contained an abundance of game. Many Eastern woodland Indians hunted and even lived on its periphery, and Osage and Quapaw Indians who claimed Arkansas lands and hunting grounds sparsely populated that territory. Still, American officials acknowledged Quapaw and Osage land claims and negotiated treaties to, quote, clear their land titles. So this is, in the green, is what the Osage theoretically ceded in 1808. So in September 1808, Missouri Governor William Clark negotiated a treaty with Osage leaders which ceded 50,000 square miles of Osage land between the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, and the treaty was finalized in November. Simultaneously, a plan was set in motion to have the Cherokees relocate to the Arkansas River Valley along with other Eastern woodland Indians. But what happened next was the removal crisis led to infighting among Cherokee leaders, and a smaller group of about 1,000 Cherokees accepted the invitation to move west. Cherokee Indian agent Return Meggs at this point made it clear that prospective Cherokee immigrants would remain landless in the West until they exchanged a proportional amount of land in the East, which they held a right to sell as members of the Cherokee Nation. Meggs and other American officials clearly ignored the existence of Cherokee immigrants known as the Old Settlers, which began migrating to the St. Francis River during the late 1780s. As a result, American leaders expected a future arrangement in which all Western Cherokee peoples collectively traded Cherokee land in the East for land rights in the West. For migrant leaders such as Talantusky, the prospect of remaining landless in the eyes of Americans generated this natural impulse to quickly establish land rights in the Trans-Mississippi West. While the new immigrants initially moved to existing Cherokee settlements along the St. Francis River, Talantusky had ambitions to colonize further west in the Arkansas River Valley. The new Madrid earthquakes, which occurred through the winter of 1811-1812, essentially destroyed Cherokee communities on the St. Francis River, but allowed Talantusky to enact his plan to settle in the Arkansas River Valley. So on this map, the very red zone is pretty much where they were living, where they felt the seismic shocks the most. The three major earthquakes rocked the hinterland, and the aftershocks were felt all over North America. the earthquakes reshaped the natural environment by choking the channel of the St. Francis River and turned the Cherokee settlements into a swampland. As a result, new Cherokee towns were eventually constructed on the White River, the Arkansas River, and at the base of the Ozark Mountains. The earthquakes quickly turned central and western parts of the Arkansas Territory into the epicenter of competition for land and resources among Western Cherokees and their allies, Osages and their allies, and Anglo-Americans. To begin separating themselves from these other socio-political groups, Cherokee leaders expressed a desire for the creation of territorial borders. Cherokee subagent William Lovely, a recent arrival in the West, quickly pressed the Cherokees' colonizing agenda by devising temporary territorial boundaries that divided Cherokee Osage and American lands in 1813. Lovely's boundaries, however, only further stimulated land disputes between the Cherokee immigrants and local tribes, the Osages and Quapaws. In 1816, the Indian commissioners that were assigned to adjudicate the disputes questioned whether or not the Cherokee immigrants were living illegally on Osage territory. They took seriously Osage complaints that Arkansas Cherokees had, quote, settled upon their lands. According to the commissioners, quote, any published maps, end quote, would confer this fact, but they were willing to wait until surveyors ran the boundary line of the Osage Purchase of 1808 to make any necessary adjudications to the intertribal boundary dispute. The commissioners were not opposed to removing the Cherokees from Osage land claims, as well as the land claims of the Quapaws on the south side of the Arkansas River, if American surveyors found those settlements to be existing within each tribe's territory. Within this context, Cherokee leaders hastily negotiated the Treaty of Hiawassee in 1817, which essentially conformed to Lovely's original 1813 boundaries, except for the land that many Western Cherokees lived on south of the Arkansas River. After signing the treaty, and this is more the focus of what I was discussing in the paper, Cherokee leaders constantly pestered the United States to mark out and run the boundaries of their land reserve to avoid further disputes over the legitimacy of their territorial claims, even after they had secured these land rights by treaty. And I was going to quickly run through a series of maps showing the evolution of how that isn't Florida, that is the Mississippi River down, and then the Arkansas River across. And then in 1822, Stephen Long, who is part of the U.S. Corps of Topographical Engineers, he drew the map of Arkansas, and this is the map, first time I could find a map that actually had one of the two Cherokee boundary lines. It's kind of hard to see, but what's the pointer? I don't know how this. But and then in 1825, David Vance drew this map published by Anthony Finley, and this is the first map that I found that had the upper boundary. And then in 1826, an even better view of what was surveyed. So the lower boundary and then the upper boundary. But this was not the only dispute. Western Cherokees also demonstrated that the absence of mapping could also serve their colonizing agenda. Mixed blood leaders such as Talantusky often spoke about Cherokee civility, their transition from hunters to farmers, yet these same leaders recognized that many Western Cherokees still relied on hunting for sustenance and to participate in the exchange economy. As a result, they wanted permanent access to Western Arkansas hunting grounds, where most of the gaming resources now resided, because Cherokees and white settlers had erected settlements in central Arkansas and essentially pushed the game further west. In 1816, William Lovely arranged a meeting between Cherokees and Osage leaders that was supposed to ease tension between the belligerent parties in the midst of their conflict. While the main objective was to obtain peace, Lovely also induced the Osage to cede a 7 million tract of land known as Lovely's Purchase, which was located from the Verdigris River to the older boundary line of Clark's Treaty. and it was supposedly went all the way down to the Cherokee lines that had been established in 1817. So the reason I put up this little sketch map, honestly, this isn't is because by the mid-1820s, Cherokees and white colonists became locked in this quasi-legal conflict over the rights to Lovelace Purchase. In 1825, anxious American settlers fervently complained that the newly surveyed Upper Cherokee boundary line gave the Indians nearly 100,000 more acres of, quote, a considerable portion of the most valuable part of Lovelace Purchase, end quote, and wondered if the Cherokees would ever, quote, cease their cravings while a foot of unappropriated land remains between them and the Osage Nation, end quote. Perhaps the Cherokees proved them right. After Cherokees leaders learned that the Americans planned to survey the remaining land lying between the Cherokee and Osage boundaries in December of 1826, they literally intercepted Rene Paul, the surveyor instructed to extensively map out Lovelace Purchase. They asked Paul for a copy of his instructions, which was extensively laid out on how to map out townships and grids within Lovelace Purchase, and then they pleaded with the surveyor to postpone his mission until the Cherokees could negotiate the annexation of more land within Lovelace Purchase from the United States government. So yeah, I'll end there, but the final resolution and the reason that to bring up this map is that the Lovelace Purchase is eventually where the Western Cherokees were moved and forms the basis of the Cherokee Nation today.
My apologies for being that attendee. Sometimes I have to set alarms to remember when to do things as a parent, and sometimes I forget to turn those alarms off, so I apologize. So I, like others today, I'm kind of assuming that the audience has read the paper, and I want to take a moment to again say thank you to the APS. I am also a recipient of the Phillips Fund, and this is also my first time getting to visit. So I am appreciative for both the previous support of my work that I had from the APS, but also the opportunity to talk about a new project that is daunting and big, and I look forward to hearing from all of you about. So I want to take a moment to kind of put this project in a larger context. So my larger book, it aims to trace the pedagogical and curricular changes and continuities that existed within the Cherokee Nation from the end of the Mississippian period through the 1970s. Just a tiny chronology. And ideally, I want this book to serve as a challenge to kind of two main scholarly audiences. One are historians of American education, who erase the educationals of histories of Native peoples before contact with Europeans. There just isn't any acknowledgement that education happened on this continent before the arrival of Europeans in most standard histories of education. The second group, though, is historians of American Indian Ed, who are a phenomenal group of scholars at delving deeply into particularly the boarding school era, that there's a beautiful literature out there. At the same time, there isn't a real discussion about how we think we know what we know about American Indian Ed. There's a lot of generalized statements made about all Native peoples taught their kids this way. And I just don't know where that evidence is coming from when we don't have tribally specific educational history. So originally what I thought this project was going to be coming off of my first book was a straight institutional history of Cherokee institutions, synthesizing the rich literature out there, and that changed drastically. Because I'm tackling this very giant chronology, I'm breaking it down and using kind of a place-based understanding of classrooms, right? That are not traditional classrooms, but that are spaces. So what you all read is me thinking through the ideas in the first chapter of my book, which is titled Gadua, a Cherokee-centered pedagogy. And the second chapter of my book is Chota Tanasi, The Proudness of Young People, and it draws upon a lot of written accounts of travelers and traders to Cherokee communities, including Alexander Long, Henry Timberlake, and William Bartram. And I'm going back to those documents to describe and analyze the kinds and purposes and types and locations of education that are discussed, usually in very small detail, within Cherokee communities in the 17th and 18th centuries. Chapter 3 is titled Willstown, which is actually an older Creek town that Cherokees moved into during the American Revolution. And that is a place that's complicated, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that location for other reasons. And chapter 4 is the Sequoia District, or school choice, and that's going to talk about post-removal school sites in exactly where Austin is describing today, that kind of loveliest purchase area of the nation. And I also want to think about removal as a loss of classroom spaces, that all of those landscapes that would have been part of an intellectual and educational landscape for Cherokee people is lost through the act of removal. And then my fifth chapter looks at Oklahoma Indian schools. So what happens in Oklahoma after the Cherokee Nation loses control of its governance and also all of the institutions that it's built, but that you still have communities that are thriving and working in all sorts of ways to preserve older educational practices. So again, originally this project was much smaller chronologically and disciplinarily. But I knew my first book was incomplete because it failed to cover Cherokee public education. But Cherokee education as a topic and a source was way too big to cover in the pages of my first book. And additionally, public education was an outlier relative to the other public welfare institutions that I studied and wrote about. So book 2, again, was supposed to be another institutional history. But then I started hanging out with cavers and archaeologists. And as a result of this, I went into caves. And this is one of the caves that I went into. Bo Carroll, who is Eastern Band Cherokee, also is an archaeology student at the University of Tennessee, and together with Bo and a few other folks, archaeologists and community members, we recently published 2 articles on our work in caves. One came out in American Antiquity in June, and the other was in Antiquity. And so within these caves, which are otherworldly, if you've never stepped foot in a cave, it's quite, it's amazing. You really get a sense of being in another world. And at the same time, I was in there to look at Sequoian syllabary on the walls and ceilings of caves written at the time of removal. So here I am in this brand new space to me with a new archive, and what I realized is I did not have the academic tool set to even read these documents. That how do you read a 3-dimensional space in a cave? How do you read a way of understanding the world that simply isn't available to you as a historian or an anthropologist? So when I stepped into these caves, my definition and chronology for studying Cherokee educational history changed. This is an educational space, and one that Mississippian peoples had been re-entering for millennia. I mean, we can date river cane torches. We know that people are coming in and out of cave sites throughout the Southeast for 1,000 years. And so I understood there was a spatial dimension to my work that I needed, that I was going to use traditional sources for, but that couldn't necessarily help me work through. So admittedly, I'm looking at maps like John Smith's A Map of Virginia with a description of the country, commodities, people, government, and religion. And this is made with the aid of an Indian informant, but still primarily reflects the preoccupations and desires of early settlers. So maps provide us insight, but they don't necessarily assist in answering all of the questions we have, especially as it relates to individual worldviews and placemaking. So the paper you read represents me trying to find a narrative voice to grapple with material that often lacks the people that we as historians often choose to write about. It also represents an informed but imaginative attempt to reconstruct classroom spaces that Cherokee students and teachers would have worked within 1,000 years ago. And so geography, the ecological world, and places with deeper histories that maps can allude to but can't capture become my area of inquiry. So this is an image of Gadua near Cherokee, North Carolina. And it is a place that's been continually occupied for 10,000 years. Archaeologists would even agree that Cherokees have occupied that space for at least 800. And it's an old and sacred place for Cherokee people. And it continually shows up on maps, but without much explanation, right? So right there on the maps, you see this place is important, and on the other hand, you know nothing. And so you have to look to other kinds of sources to get to the heart of how Cherokee people are thinking about the world and the classroom spaces they're valuing. And so the few native-produced maps that we have can actually be incredibly helpful. Native map makers, informant, and artists made it clear that spatiality mattered. These documents reinforce and allude to the importance of relationships between native people and non-native peoples, and native and non-human neighbors and kin. So Ian Chambers has done a great article that suggests that this was actually a Cherokee-produced map. But the biggest figure on this map is a woman. And Cherokees and their southeastern neighbors are matrilineal. And so for all of us, this makes perfect sense. So they also reinforce some artistic conventions and ways of expressing space and relations within those spaces that can tell me which kinds of curriculum endured and which kinds of teaching materials endured and maintained themselves in spite of other major changes occurring in Native people's lives. So this final image you're looking at is actually a pictograph on my right. And the image on the left is actually the ceiling of the cave. And the pictograph is depicting Native Southerners' understandings of themselves in relationship to other Native people, but also non-Native people, right? And they do it creating these circles in order to understand those relationships of where they are in relationship to other people. And so why am I putting this image next to this cave ceiling? Well, within this image on the ceiling, there is a message to people who are above the roof of that ceiling, expressing kinship relationships. So they're still using these circular spatial understandings of relationship, but using language now to convey those relationships to an otherworldly presence. And this suggests to me we've got to rethink both how we look at maps, but also how we think about spatiality more broadly when we're considering Indigenous worldviews in other moments. So I look forward to the conversation that follows, as well as Maggie's comments. So thank you all.
So thank you so much for those just amazing papers. As you may have noticed, the panel papers are narrow in geographic and temporal scope, or at least to a certain degree. All three focus on the South, and as the conference demands, all are focused on the early American Republic. Being tightly woven together around a particular place is in some ways a form of placemaking itself, and thus the world they collectively excavate is, to borrow a term from Professor Reed's paper, multidimensional. As a legal scholar, I'll comment on the papers individually while drawing out the legal themes as best I can shared between all three papers. Jeff Washburn takes us into Chickasaw country and explores how the Chickasaw Nation was shaped by the southern interior, the isolated place over which they claimed dominion, a place shielded from the immediate pressures of settler colonialism. But also how the Chickasaw Nation shaped the place in which they lived by controlling the landscape, and most importantly, the throughways, the, quote, battlegrounds of sovereignty, as Washburn describes them. Notably, the Chickasaw also engage in placemaking by lawmaking. In particular, they leveraged American law to their benefit by wielding notarized maps as binding precedent against American encroachment. Ultimately, the geopolitical practices of isolation proved insufficient, and the Chickasaws ceded through treaty the geography that had shielded them previously. But Washburn's example illustrates the legal agency and ingenuity of Native nations to control and protect the land over which they could assert dominion. Austin Stewart takes us to the territory of the Arkansas, or Western Cherokee, and explores how the Cherokee adopted the practices of surveying land and drawing borders in order to make the place in which they lived. These methods did not capture the lived experience of the Cherokee people, whose own cartographic techniques reflected a world structured not around borders, but around relationships and the paths between. It was, as Stewart so aptly termed, a, quote, human geography that Cherokee, or potentially Catawba maps, sought to inscribe. The Chickasaw, the Western Cherokee, like the Chickasaw, the Western Cherokee leveraged American law, which had codified the science of surveying and the power of abstract peripheral borders into its doctrine, both in terms of property and sovereignty. Also, like the Chickasaw, the Western Cherokee realized that the preservation of people and place meant that they must control the geography in which they lived, and they must leverage all material, legal, and political tools at their disposal to maintain that control. Surveying land and drawing borders did not capture the experience of the Cherokee, but it offered the possibility of preserving it. Professor Reed takes us into the territory of the Cherokee also, although in her paper we're taken east to the city of Gadua. Reed provides thick first-person accounts of the multidimensional lived experience of Gadua, a mother city to the Cherokee people, a geography rich in sensorial experience and interrelated being. American maps, Reed warns, nowhere capture the richness of Native lived experience, an experience focused on relationships, not resource extraction. By Reed's account, non-natives have been distracted students at best, and at worst have used maps as, quote, geopolitical statements of territorial appropriation that erased Indian geography by replacing Indian domains with the blank spaces of pristine wilderness awaiting colonial development. These papers collectively teach us that maps are not simply, quote, geopolitical statements. They are themselves law, or at the very least are instruments legible to a legal system that has wielded immense and often inordinate power in North America since the early Republic. Maps here are like complaints filed in a court, or at the very least supporting evidence for a complaint. The Native people described in each paper have much to teach modern scholars about Native understandings of this law. The Cherokees and the Chickasaws described in each of the papers leveraged the law through maps and map-making techniques. These maps, like Reed and Stewart describe, were not a practice engaged in by natives to capture and convey a Native perspective of the landscape. Maps to Native people were not placemaking in the sense of capturing and molding lived experience, but the papers collectively teach us that maps are not something that we ought to dismiss out of hand either. Maps may still be, quote, silent witnesses to the past, but Native history and Native studies must take care to place those silent witnesses where they belong, which is in a courtroom and in the practice of lawmaking rather than placemaking. Washburn and Stewart show how Native nations in the South were able to shield their own sense of place by leveraging law. Maps may be silent witnesses of this advocacy. Embracing these maps as legal tools could provide an even more multidimensional understanding of Native people as they capture Native agency, not simply a lived world above and below, but also the way Natives imagined and mastered their own futures. These are legal documents. Native nations and Native people have long leveraged law as a tool to ensure the survivance of our people. Identifying maps as tools of lawmaking also rightly places these papers into a much longer historiography of Native legal advocacy. It also allows us to see potential impacts wrought by the early adoption of certain forms of law. The adoption of non-Native territorial practices has meant that Native nations now reside within an Indian country with carefully mapped, although highly contested, borders. The same fight described in the papers over borders continues until the modern day. So the Supreme Court is actually currently reviewing a case. It's called Sharp v. Murphy, was previously called Carpenter v. Murphy, for those interested, as to whether the Muskogee Creek Reservation in Oklahoma retains its original borders. So they're fighting over the same borders we hear in the papers. Maps remain a vital tool in this fight. It's difficult to imagine a silver lining to a 200-year fight, although it's important to remember that the fight is only ongoing because the notion of borders has been incredibly sticky as a legal tool leveraged against the United States. The Cherokees and Chickasaws of the 18th and early 19th century displayed incredible legal foresight in adopting these tools. The borders fought so fiercely over have allowed many of the over 560 federally recognized Native nations to thrive. Reed provides a remarkable lived example in her paper of her modern experience of Gadua. It bears noting, though, that Reed's ability to visit the city, and perhaps the city's very preservation, is owed to the preserved borders of the eastern band of Cherokee Nation, which generated enough income to purchase the land Gadua is on in 1996 and to open it to band members like Reed. Beyond celebration, it's also important to reflect on the not-so-celebratory impacts of adopting these legal strategies. The recognition and internalization of borders has allowed Native nations to thrive, but these maps have failed to protect the lived experience of Native peoples that falls outside these borders. The Bears Ears Monument and the Dakota Access Pipeline are recent examples. All of these sacred places are part of the multidimensional lived experience that Reed describes, but the inability of borders and maps to protect these places has been devastating to Indian country. Gadua is actually a rare exception. These papers collectively offer lessons for scholars on the archival use of maps, but the papers offer lessons for modern law also. They teach that the ongoing reliance on a two-dimensional legal strategy might have protected Native people in certain ways, but may have only protected a two-dimensional vision of Indian country. Thank you very much.
I'd invite the panelists to respond to these comments, and we'll open it up for questions. No? Okay.
Thank you. I have a question for Jeff. Jeff, my geography may be off, but it seems to me that the Creek War of 1813 would have taken place pretty much either east of the Chickasaw territory or maybe even abutting it. And I'm just wondering how the Chickasaw were involved, if they were involved, and if they weren't involved, how did they manage to stay out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question with it. So for the Chickasaws, they for about 20 years before then, they were really not involved with many conflicts. They were involved with the Creek-Chickasaw War in the mid-1790s, and they were involved in actually supporting the United States with conflicts against pan-tribal groups in the early 1790s. With the Creeks, they had a defined enmity towards certain townships with the Creeks. And when Tecumseh actually came through and tried to get Southern Indians involved in his larger pan-tribal movement, and kind of that's one instigator for the larger Red Stick movement. He goes through Chickasaw country, and they absolutely refuse to even allow him to actually make a talk. When the United States petitions both the Choctaws, or petitions the Choctaws, the Cherokees, and the Chickasaws to involve themselves, this is actually the first time that the war leader for the Chickasaws, William Glover, is actually basically brought in. His opinion is the primary opinion. It's the first time that he's really kind of a head person inside of the council in about 20 years. It kind of shows how little they're involved with warfare at this point in time. They are actually involved with the Red Stick War, but they are almost entirely on the side of the Americans. They actually help take down the Maroon Fort at Prospect Bluff in the Apalachicola region, or they attack it along with Pensacola. Davy Crockett is part of that group that they're fighting with. And then the other part with it too is that they actually they make a profit out of it. Colbert and his ferry is one way that Jackson is able to funnel troops and supplies down to New Orleans for the Battle of New Orleans. And basically the Colberts are able to swing that into into profit with it. And quite literally, like the 1801 treaty that defines that federal road passing through, and the fact that they're able to kind of transform that into economic benefit for them pays dividends during the War of 1812 and during the Red Stick conflict. So while most of the Red Stick conflict is over in Creek country, which is, like you said, to the east of them, they're very much involved in this larger case with the rest of the Native South and with the rest of the American South and the Gulf South with fighting about the War of 1812 and the Red Stick conflict. And they're able to profit from it. They're fighting inside of it. And by the end of it, they're at a disadvantage from it because, again, like that green area that I kind of showed with it, that's basically an area that Americans are starting to occupy immediately after the Red Stick conflict and the Treaty of Fort Jackson. So they fought with the Americans, and they that helps them to maintain a pragmatic peace, but at the same time, they end up losing their, that's kind of the beginning of the end of their territorial autonomy with it. So I hope that answers.
No, that's good, thank you. I first found out about the Red Stick War in 1956 by watching Davy Crockett.
Yeah, that old Disney movie is ironically one of the reasons why I started getting into this. So it's an embarrassing thing, but.
Next, I have a question for Julian, just to follow up for Maggie, and I also saw Jeff and I think Austin nodding their head during Maggie's comment. So, Julie, the caves, I mean, those are fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they're dated? I mean, you dated them to the era of removal, so that process. And then I noticed in the photograph that there's metal structures, and I just didn't know, what is their current status? Who has access to them? What are plans for preservation and all those questions?
Cave sites are about 60 miles apart that we've gone into. So they're not close, but they're not far either. One cave is on public lands and is accessible off of a road. I mean, that cave is, I think I mentioned in the paper, my daughter has actually duck crawled into the cave. That's the one she duck crawled in. I had to army crawl in. I mean, the opening is very small. The other cave is privately owned. Which, yes, you too can aspire to own a cave one day. I did not know that until, it never occurred to me that you could own a cave. But hey, you learn things. And so that cave, the reason we actually went in and started doing some of this work was because the cave was changing hands. And a caving group offered to clean up the graffiti in the cave in order to maintain access, an act of goodwill. Unfortunately, a lot of the syllabary is buried underneath all of that graffiti. And so at that point, archaeologists at Tennessee stepped in and said, don't touch anything because we lose everything if you do that. So it was that point that we went in, that we had been alerted to this cave change. Somebody had already mentioned the material might be there. And at that point, the research really started more heavily. So there is a lot of, this one particular cave was also a show cave. So it was one of those early electrified caves that people toured, lots of events got held, but a lot of the syllabary is not on that path. It's not, I mean, there are portions of it that have metal barriers and structures, but you have to go about a half mile deep beyond that tour to get to the sections that we were actually looking at. But on the way down, you are seeing single syllables all over the walls at every level, which we're not sure what that is. We're not sure if it's somebody practicing their use of the syllabary. We're not sure if it's I go to the stomp ground. There are songs that are sung that have no translation. It's just sounds. And so, is this a song? Is it some kind of a ceremony? I mean, we don't know. Again, there's all of these questions that we'll probably never have answers to. There are also narratives in both caves. So someone has actually taken the time to write a narrative and sign it and date it. And so that's how we have dating for at least 2 pieces that have been written, both from 1829. So Wright kind of his removal is amping up and describing kind of, we have argued that one is a description of a ball game that's taken place, which is not out of the realm, although it's also an activity that's becoming increasingly policed by missionaries and is trying to be stamped out by federal agents. And so there's a reason that one might write about these events no longer out in the public, but going into a cave to do so. The cave also has water flowing through it, and is also, it's a space to get away. And so if you're performing rituals connected to that ball game, the cave is a perfect location for those ceremonies and rituals to happen. And the descriptions are consistent with what? Getting bloodied during a game, losing, getting beaten by the other side. And so that's one of the descriptions. What's on the roof is not dated. And that's a very different kind of writing. I mean, it's not meant to record an event. It's meant to have a conversation with the upper realm, and what actually is there can only be, it's meant to be read by those who are looking down from above, not from those of us looking up to the ceiling, which is fascinating in and of itself. As in terms of preservation, this has been one of my concerns that, as I've gotten further into this project, is that how do we protect these sites? I mean, the TVA has their own police, like archaeology police, because people are constantly dynamiting gates and shooting off locks. And so the Eastern Band paid for gates to be installed in both of these locations that are actually bat-friendly, but that only the Eastern Band, and in the one case, the Park Service locally has access to that cave, and a speleological group. And then the other cave, the owner of the cave actually has access, but the Eastern Band does too. So there is a preservation effort, but at the same time, it's not a perfect system. There's still a danger attached. So
We have one last question.
Thanks. This is a question for Jeff and for Austin, I think. So you show us both how this treaty process that is often coercive creates bounded spaces for Native groups, but you also suggest that there's a homeland that precedes these negotiations, but we don't have really a map of that, right? We have, and Jeff, in your first slide, you show these hashed areas that show Chickasaw, Creek, and Choctaw homelands. How has your research into this process of treaty definition, a homeland definition, revealed something about the tension of those new boundaries with some pre-existing conception of Native homelands, and how do they come into play in these negotiated processes?
That's a really good question. I think this is one of the best parts about at least for me, attending this conference. It's learning a little bit more concerning map making and boundaries with this. It's also something that when it comes to a lot of these regions and buffer zones and like the idea of shared spaces, shared hunting grounds, this is something that actually Lucas Kelly will be talking about with his paper tomorrow, so stick around for that. But with the Chickasaws, the toughest part for me right now when I'm looking at this kind of space with this interior South and with kind of identifying their homeland or the kind of the settled area and how they're negotiating it with other indigenous communities as well as with European communities or Euro-American communities. It's the fact of where they're settling, and then also kind of understanding these different buffer zones that they're able to kind of create, how they're viewing hunting grounds, how they're transforming hunting grounds into places where they're either kind of like that back and forth between shared hunting grounds versus how they're incorporating what's going on inside of the West with the Quapaw. It is very much a mutually agreed kind of situation where the fact that they are going into Quapaw territory and they are actually acting sometimes as Quapaw muscle against the Osage. There's multiple times where federal agents are terrified about the fact that they write about the fact that the Chickasaws and the Cherokees are actually going out there and fighting against the Osage, and this is destabilizing the region from the ability for federal agents to actually influence the region. So it's the one, I guess, the part with this kind of coming around is the fact that the lands that the Chickasaw occupy and the lands that they exert influence over is again, something that kind of moves and flows with the situation. We see the expansion of settlement practices during basically from the 1760s to the 1830s, larger settlement patterns, the reaffectation, the reassignment of former hunting grounds to cattle ranches. It's a transformative process, and I think it's just kind of one of those things that I'm still trying to learn and get a little bit more of a good feel about, I guess, how it transforms and how it changes and how that affects the Chickasaws and their view of both their homeland and the interior South. I think I went a little bit around your question, but I hope I answered a little bit of it.
Just to add on, I think, well, first of all, I think what I'm doing is complicating that question even further by saying, well, what does the group do? This is one of the driving forces behind my whole dissertation, is what does the group do when they're moving to a place that isn't considered their homeland? So in other words, what I'm saying is that I do think that the Anglo style of border making practices is it's part of the colonizing strategy, but also the reason they have to do it is because they have to generate claims to lands to start with. They start settling. So there's a lot of on the ground activities that create these claims. They say, look at us, we're farming in this place, we're doing this, we're doing that. But there is still no sense of geography. And so they have to create their own sense of geography via warfare on one hand, but also via negotiating these treaties. So it is complex, and soft boundaries become hard boundaries become soft boundaries, and this happens even in the 18th century as well. I talk about this transformation of territoriality, but also it's more flexible than the paper admits in terms of like what is still considered within your territory. Usually hunting grounds, they can be contested, they can be shared, but they also can be actually like agreed upon between groups. And in this case, what I'm saying is that these weren't agreed upon. There wasn't, so everyone's trying to carve out their own space.
Please do join me in thanking our speakers.